everyone. Welcome to Filipino on the Rise. I'm Crystal Fabella, host and founder. I really hope you enjoy this episode. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so that you never miss out on new video content. You can find all episodes on most podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, Anchor, FM, and more. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Asian American resistance and solidarity with Black and Brown communities has always been part of our history. But what really kind of messed us up was the political construction of the model minority myth. When we uphold this stereotype that Asians have basically overcome racism through their hard work, it's a way to undermine Black power movements and their claims that systemic racism still exists. I think the history of colonization in the Philippines actually really positions Filipino Americans to be in solidarity with Black and Brown communities in this country. We have a different journey that is unique to us. And one way we can figure that out and navigate it is learning our own histories together.
Welcome to the Filipina on the Rise podcast, where I spotlight Filipino women doing big things and making an impact. I'm your host, Crystal Fabella, and I aim to highlight Filipina excellence and celebrate what it means to be a Filipina. This episode is a little bit different today, as I am so honored to have on with us Bianca Mabute-Louie, who is our first non-Filipina guest. She's Chinese American and an ally of the Filipino community, not to mention she's married to a Filipino. Bianca is an educator based in Oakland, California. She has taught Asian American Studies at Laney College, SF State, and City College of San Francisco. This fall, she will be starting her PhD in Sociology at Rice University, where she will pursue research on religion, race, and racism. Bianca has also organized the Network on Religion and Justice for Queer Affirmation in Christian Churches, and with API Legal Outreach on domestic violence prevention among youth of color. On this episode, we discuss the role of the Filipino American and greater Asian American community in this moment of time, and more importantly, the historical and political framing of our solidarity with Black communities. We also discuss how the model minority myth has been used as a tool to pit communities of color against each other. Then we discuss how we can be more effective allies by confronting internalized racism and anti-Blackness within our own people, and how to start talking to our own communities. This episode is a really important and special one to me. I will not be an additional person acknowledging the current crisis. We all know at this point that we're in a pandemic. In the midst of all these, we have grieved 3 more innocent Black lives: George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. The murder of George Floyd was in a way the straw that broke the camel's back. It reignited the movement nationwide calling for justice, police reform, and that Black lives matter. At the same time, my heart has been unsettled, seeing yet another divide after protests broke out. People almost taking sides. Even more unsettling seeing this in the Filipino and wider Asian American community. While COVID-19 brought out present realities of anti-Asian sentiment and violence, not to undermine those, but what these recent murders of Black lives and the reactions around them have shown is that our country is in deep need of racial reckoning still. What I've seen is that this current movement is forcing individual Asian American communities to really look at ourselves and understand not only how do we show solidarity, but understand what is our role in this. How has our community either stood against anti-Blackness and racism, or maybe have been silenced and even complicit? It's forced us to look at our own communities and even families and ask hard questions. What do we need to learn and unlearn? How do we become effective allies? What do we do in our real lives offline to really be in solidarity? Get ready for an incredible discussion with Bianca. Here we go. Bianca, thank you so much for coming on this show at short notice. I know that times are really crazy right now, and just for you to continually be giving your voice on these important matters and creating so much digestible content for our community is it's really powerful. It's people have even said like you've helped them decolonize their own minds and
Wow.
understanding racism and inequality in our country and how it applies to their own activism and solidarity. So I just want to let you know that people are working on their internalized racism and decolonization because of your work. So I just want to
Thank you so
applaud you for
much.
that. Yeah. And just a little, I wanted to make sure we can give you a little background because of I reached out to you. We really wanted to make an episode focused on Asian and Black solidarity, how to address not just racism, but anti-Blackness within the API community and the Filipino community.
Mhm.
And I reached out to you because your studies are focused on this. You're entering your PhD this fall, and you've just been for your whole, I guess, academic life, just working around. You were organizing, you did ethnic studies in college, Asian American studies. And so I just want to give you the space to give a warm intro about you. And I know that you're actually Chinese American. Your spouse, as you mentioned, Filipino, and maybe how that dynamic, the combination of those two identities have played with your role and how you see everything going on right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Crystal, for having me on your podcast. I guess a little background about me. I grew up actually in Southern California, but have lived in Oakland for the past 12 years and have always been interested in issues of equity and power. And but it really was through, I think, ethnic studies where I clarified kind of my purpose in pursuing social justice, liberation for our people through political education and really building space with people to, like we said earlier, decolonize the ideas that they were brought up with, to really unpack, their experiences in racial structures in this country. Actually, I was doing stuff like that before ethnic studies too. I was involved in faith organizing and actually ministry, evangelical ministry.
Nice.
Yeah, and in that space, what really made me actually come alive was, again, creating space for people to talk about how their faith interconnected with issues of racial justice that we were seeing. And at that time when I was doing that kind of organizing, Ferguson uprising was happening. So there was a lot for the students I was working with to kind of process and think through.
Yeah.
I think right now I am entering a PhD program in the fall, and I am aware that that is such a privilege that you just don't see a lot of people like me in academia, in social sciences like that. And so I'm really, I guess, right now trying to ground in my commitment to make my work in academia accessible and translatable to my community.
Yeah, I remember when we first spoke, you said the baseline of that was this question you asked yourself, like, what's the point of my career if it's not translatable into the community, and how that has like formed the way that you produce your content and your work. To listeners, when you go on Bianca's social media platform, I really love that you make these booklets, these almost sketches and doodles that educate on history and like political frameworks about racism and ethnic studies, things like that. When you say like it has to be translatable to your community if you're going to be learning this work. And I remember you said there was like privileges with even doing high academia, and you want to
Yeah.
bring that back on the ground. Can you tell me more about like that intention that you had?
Yeah, so I think that value really got instilled in me actually in grad school at SF State, actually with my work, and being mentored by a lot of Filipinas in that space, specifically Ate Allison Tintiangco Cubales and Manong Arlene Daos Magwal, who I learned basically to teach through the organization they started called Pinoy Pinay Educational Partnerships. Manong Rod is also part of that and also a director of that. I didn't want to leave him out. But yeah, I think the whole point of being part of that organization, and specifically during the time of me being in grad school in that organization, was bringing the things that I was learning in the classroom into actual classrooms in the community. And so the program was about instituting ethnic studies and Filipino American studies in SFUSD schools from kindergarten to college. And so I had the privilege of working on one of their high school teaching teams, and I got to teach Filipino American studies at Burton
No
High School.
way.
Yeah, yeah. And so it
You're
was
like more Filipino than me, I swear.
and so that was just such a transformative experience
Yeah.
where it was about
How
bringing
so?
the work that and things that we were learning in higher education into the community, and specifically to kids and youth, right, who are not too young to talk about these things and are not too young to understand concepts like power and injustice. And so
Wow.
that really, I think, grounded me in my commitment to make sure that this work is translatable to people outside of academia, to people who maybe never had the opportunity to go to college, people who have no interest in taking an ethnic studies class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm very curious, like doing like academic work and studies and whatnot around Filipino American history. Like, can you just give us a little like insight on like what you've observed in the context of our own history and how it plays into the overall work of like Asian American
Yeah.
decolonizing ourselves and
Okay, so I'm totally not the expert to speak on this, but I can
no,
speak as an outsider, right, to the
yeah.
community. And I recognize that, yeah, my positionality as someone who's East Asian, who's Chinese American, is very different from
Mm.
Filipino Americans. So I think some things that I've noticed, I think the history of colonization in the Philippines actually really positions Filipino Americans to be in solidarity with Indigenous folks and Black and Brown communities in this country because,
Mm.
yeah, again, from what I have learned, I guess as an ally and outsider that has been invited into these spaces, there is so much rich history of Filipinx resistance to fascism, to colonization. And of course, a lot of those histories are erased through things like the model minority myth and through
Yeah,
just the realities of diaspora and
right.
immigration. But that's why things like ethnic studies, Asian American studies is so important. And I've
Mm.
really seen, at least in the Bay Area, it's really beautiful. The Filipino American community is really beautiful in that they're so organized and there are so many resources from what I can see to teach this political education and history to each
Yeah.
other.
I think that's really powerful, the remembrance of Philippines history in that we've been colonized over and over again. And even by, when the US military came in, we forget that we've been equipped to deal with this for a long
Mm,
time. And
yeah.
it's just really frustrating to see the racism or the anti-blackness still within our own community when we forget like this has been something that we I guess have been fighting for a long time. And so my question is always like, why have we forgotten and why have we been pit against and why do we almost like utilize the racial hierarchy here in America to put ourselves above this race when we forget this has been in our history, in our blood for generations. And so you wanted to start it off by giving like a brief historical political framing on all this before we even talk about like Asian and Black solidarity and how to move forward. We have to look back, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you said that why the communities have been pit against each other, just to understand this moment in time. Like, give us a brief, as brief as you can,
Yeah.
kind of history on that.
Yeah. Well, I think a big part of it, so, like I said earlier, Asian American resistance and solidarity with Black and Brown communities has always been part of our history. But specifically, I think what really kind of like interrupted that and kind of messed us up was the political construction of the model minority myth.
Mm,
And so it was never, the model minority myth is the stereotype that Asians are high achieving, that they have a quote unquote like diligent work ethic that has made them and allowed them to overcome racism. And so is a myth that was constructed actually during the Reagan era, during his very hyper conservative politics, and at the same time as Black Power movements were gaining traction and attention. And so, this model minority myth, as you can see, when we uphold this stereotype that Asians have basically, overcome racism through their hard work, it's a way to undermine Black Power movements and their claims that systemic racism still exists.
mm,
It was
mm,
also a way for the political party of that era to dismantle social welfare programs, to try to destroy affirmative action initiatives, right? Because if there's this assumption that Asians were once discriminated against, but have worked hard enough to overcome these systemic barriers, why do we need all of these social services?
yeah.
Hmm.
Wow. It's almost like this, like just manipulating like what's really going on. And
Totally.
I know that, the state has used the vulnerabilities of poor people of color communities like to pit themselves against each other. In what other ways were they literally having now to like be put against each other? Like whether it was like fighting for resources or just like representation?
Yeah, I think one example or case study we can look at is college admissions, which is still
Mm,
a highly contested issue, specifically around affirmative action. And we see a lot of actually Chinese Americans really buying into this model minority myth
mm,
and believing that affirmative action hurts them. Um,
yeah.
because they think that if we give more spots to Black people who are quote unquote undeserving, there will be less spots for
Mm.
Asian Americans who have worked really hard and paid for SAT classes, all these things,
Mhm.
right? And that really comes from a place of scarcity mentality, also crab mentality. I've heard that term used. And so I think like this goes back to the problem of capitalism where there's an assumed finite number of resources. And we can see that the way that higher education is structured, that those politics are reflected in how Asian Americans engage with admissions. So
Mhm.
I think another thing I want to highlight that I think is interesting in this is throughout history, it's really about Asian labor being used as a political strategy to uphold white supremacy. So, what I mean by that is in the model minority myth, it really is about Asian labor and work ethic, again, upholding
Wow.
these white supremacist ideas that if you work hard enough.
Work hard, keep your head low.
Yeah, but even before,
Don't speak
yeah,
up, keep like and you like silence is
totally.
the very thing that contributes to this being perpetuated.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's this assumption that, the model minority is also apolitical. That's why they're
Yeah.
a good worker. They're not going to, like, file a,
Yeah.
workplace discrimination
'Cause can
complaint.
you take me back to that a little bit
Yeah.
of, like, did the working class were they truly apolitical, or was it just,
Mhm.
like,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
big, like, caste structure?
That's a really good question. Well, if you look at Asian American history, it is the working class Asians who really organized, practiced civil disobedience, and fought for labor rights. There's this really awesome story.
Yeah,
I think it was in the 70s, a bunch of factory workers, garment factory workers, who were mostly Chinese immigrant women, actually, were being severely exploited, like we see today.
yeah.
And they organized and they went on strike for, I think, months, to demand better wages and workers' rights. And their movement actually sparked a lot of similar strikes that happened in other factories facing similar conditions around the
Mhm.
world. And yeah, if you look at history, like that has been part of our DNA.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is interesting because I think my parents for a long time were like, oh, they have progressive ideas, but I think they feel hesitant to act on them, I guess,
Yeah,
and are apolitical in many ways. Except
yeah.
recently, my dad said that he actually tried to go to March, which I feel like so proud of him for doing.
That's a great first step.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he got the
Yeah.
time wrong, which is so, like,
Ah,
typical of him, but, the gesture meant a lot to me because
okay.
I don't think he would have ever said something like that before. But anyways, what I was saying was I think, like, a lot of our folks, actually Chinese and Filipinos and other Asian countries, like, before they came to America, political activism was severely suppressed, and there was, like, really real consequences if you were to speak out against the government. You could lose your life. Your family
Wow.
could lose their lives. And so I think that's inherited trauma that
Mm,
people bring over with them. And so I think when we're talking to our parents, we have to be sensitive of the ways that
yeah.
they actually might have trauma around what it means to be politicized.
Wow.
And so there's like a intergenerational healing work that we have the opportunity to engage in right now too.
Mhm. That just always makes me think about how truly nuanced the the work of like decolonizing our own communities and the culture around like thinking about racial equality is. It doesn't just start from like a quick education on like present rights. Like we have to like really look back and see what happened within our own histories and within like how the state has even done a lot of indoctrination about all this stuff. And so back on you were talking about like when we think about the historical and political context of all this, we have to remember the model minority myth, and how this was like a tool
Hmm.
for anti-blackness almost specifically. And
Hmm.
I think on the show you said these myths of success come at a cost.
Hmm.
Can you tell me about that cost? And I know you mentioned anti-blackness, like brown labor. Yeah, what is the cost and who's paying? And how do we think we're benefiting, but like who's really paying?
Yeah, yeah. I think because a lot of Asian Americans I talk to and even family members are like, well, we worked really hard and we did experience
Mm,
poverty. And because of our hard work and perseverance, we've given you a stable life.
mm,
And there's this stereotype that, well, people who are poor must just be lazy. And I think like what gets missed in that is that this idea of the model minority quote unquote success comes at actually a great cost, specifically, black and brown labor,
yeah.
wage theft, undocumented labor, the theft of
Mm,
indigenous land. All of these conditions of inequality in the US kind of set the stage for us to supposedly succeed, along
Wow.
with the model minority myth, right? And so I think like when we think about success for our communities, we really have to think outside of this individualist framework and
Yeah.
understand how the cost has actually been carried by other communities of color who actually,
Mhm.
during the civil rights era, did march for us to be able to come into this country, for immigration exclusion policies to be lifted.
Mm.
Um, Not only are they paying the cost in terms
But
of,
they were fighting
yeah,
also
yes,
for us and our rights.
yep,
Gosh. Oh, that I don't know why that just makes me livid with, like, now seeing the reactions of people to all this. It's just like, yo, like, we
yeah,
need to remember, like, we're walking on land and experiencing privileges and freedoms that we didn't fight for. Like, we immigrated here and certain, like, rights were set up for us, and
right.
they didn't just come out of nowhere. Can we talk about that for a second? Like,
Um,
when we talk about voting rights or just, like, the right to better wages or something, like, us immigrating here, we do navigate territories where rights have been fought by Black and Brown communities. Can you tell me about that, and what are those rights that we benefit from that a lot of us, like, maybe don't know about, and that we kind of parade around like we worked hard, we got here, but it's like we couldn't have gone there without specific rights that were fought by Black and Brown communities.
Hmm. I think everything we kind of owe to Black and Brown communities, whether it's desegregation of schools or integration of schools. I mean, even affirmative action was pushed for by Black communities in solidarity with Asian and Latinx communities who all faced very real systemic barriers to higher education, and those are things that we benefited from. um, yeah, all of the things you named, voting rights. I think on another podcast I was on, one of my colleagues, Nate Tan, said, the whole world has benefited from Black people struggling and
Yeah.
resisting and pushing for liberation because
Mm.
I think in many ways Black folks experience so many intersections of oppression, and when the quote that we're not free until everyone is free is really true. And
Mm.
the Black community has really taught us what it means to push for liberation on all fronts
Mm.
in different sectors, yeah, through different
Yeah.
systems.
And they've given us the tools and the framework that we have borrowed when it comes to organizing and activism, right?
Right.
Yeah. I almost like want to know now because your spouse is Filipino American.
Yes.
Yes. How you've engaged with like how Filipino Americans now are reacting, responding.
I think my partner and I share very similar views. Well, I guess I could share a little bit about his awakening. It's actually pretty cool.
Yeah, please
So
do.
yeah, we met actually. We used to work together in the faith organizing ministry job that I was talking about. But we actually, I guess, got together or had more of a connection when we took a solidarity trip to the Philippines, and
Oh.
that actually happened to be the summer right before Mike Brown was murdered by the police and everything arose in Ferguson. And so at the trip we were on, we were with several other students who I'm still really close to. We basically partnered with faith communities and churches in slum areas, and
Mm.
partnered with the work that they were doing, mostly around youth and violence prevention. But it was really there where actually I saw, yeah, my partner and a lot of the Filipino students and staff who were part of that. It was through, I think, like this homecoming that they had, this learning and unlearning things about what it meant to be Filipino. I think a lot of folks on that trip who identified as Filipino were able to learn to love themselves again and learn to kind of decolonize what beauty meant,
Wow.
and learn about what power they held as Filipino
Mm.
Americans. And I think again, like the relationship building we did with folks who again were really living on the margins of society in
Mhm.
slum communities, experiencing really intense poverty. I don't want to like glamorize poverty, or
Oh,
I
yeah.
think like there's a way that like Christian missions trips can really do that.
Totally. Oh,
We
yeah,
really,
totally.
yeah, we really were, I think, very purposeful to not make it about that, but really make it about kind of a mutual learning and partnership experience. And I think it was, again, partnering with folks who really knew what it meant to resist and hold on to their agency and assert their dignity in the midst of very dehumanizing situations.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Filipino Americans on that trip, were able to kind of actually reclaim what it meant to be Filipino, that
Mm-hmm.
it was about Filipino American identity is about resilience in the midst of, again, such dehumanizing
Yeah.
context and history, and that they continue to organize and love each other and celebrate each other.
Yeah.
And so it was actually then, right? And on that trip too, we also did a lot of um, unlearning around why these extreme conditions of poverty exist. And so I think like a lot of us left that trip with a more critical analysis of how power structures work, a more critical analysis of race, class, and power and politics in general. And so when we came back to what felt like the world on fire, because literally that week was like Mike Brown's murder, and then all of the uprisings afterwards. And so we kind of came back with very sensitive to racial injustice. And I think it was those personal experiences and relationships, and really, again, learning to love ourselves, understand our own histories, that kind of activated folks to take their place in racial justice movement.
Yeah, I love that because it almost makes me think of like a tool to really start, I guess, decolonizing ourselves and fighting against racial injustice and being good allies is by having a true like history rundown on our own history and like how we organized or were resilient in the past, like just starting there. It just makes me hopeful to hear that because I'm always thinking about ways like I sometimes feel like I'm in an echo chamber
Mm,
of like organizers, activists, thought leaders and stuff. And like we're putting out this content. And it's like, this is getting so real, like connecting all the dots, like people are forming like alliances with each other. And then you go back to like our more traditional communities back at home and our families. And it just feels like we're like world away behind.
yeah,
Like, people they don't have the same lens at all and the same like mental framework on how to even like look at everything going on. And it's disheartening sometimes, like where do we start? But it makes me think like, yeah, maybe we can start with ourselves and like maybe educating our own people, however, whatever generation they're from, on like remembering like
yeah.
this is what we've done in the past for centuries. Is that something that maybe resonates with you as well? Hey everyone, I wanted to take a quick break and give a shout out to our new Patreon supporters, Alexander, Aaron, and Maria. Thank you so much for your support. With you, this show is so much better. To listeners, I would love if you could consider being a Patreon supporter. You can pledge $1, $3, or $5 a month or make a one-time donation. What will you get? You can get a Filipino on the Rice sticker, a personal shout out, and make direct requests for guests and more. Your financial support would go directly to things like better recording equipment, getting even better guests, and more content. Please visit at patreon.com/Filipina on the Rise, and the link is also on the show notes. Okay, now back to the show. Maybe we can start with ourselves and like maybe educating our own people, whatever generation they're from, on like remembering like this is what we've done in the past for centuries. Is that something that maybe resonates with you as well?
Yeah, I think that kind of it's not just political education, but it's remembering, because so much of being in this country and being successful in this country is actually forgetting who you are, and that is
Mm.
also the cost of
Oh,
assimilation, right?
I'm like snapping right now.
I think especially so.
Mm.
My spouse and his family actually live in Houston, and that's where I'm moving in the fall too. And the climate there does feel a bit different, and what it looks like to be Asian American there feels very different than in the Bay Area, where I think like again, just assimilation is a lot more real. Um,
Yeah.
and so again, with that comes kind of the erasure of these histories we're talking about that can really ground us and empower us.
Mhm. Mhm. Is there work being done for that like to bring back the erasure and like to remember and to
Yeah,
re-educate older communities?
yeah, that's a great question.
I don't know. Like I was just thinking about it. I'm like, I wonder.
Yeah, because the intergenerational part is really, really important, and
Yeah.
I also feel like I'm in an echo chamber because most folks I talk to are also my age, which is very
Yeah.
specific demographic. Um,
And then you go on Facebook and I'm like, "Oh, that's where my aunties and uncles are at right
yeah.
now." Like
Yeah, yeah, I definitely don't have an answer to this, but
No, it's
one
okay.
thing I've been thinking about actually in terms of the intergenerational stuff,
Yeah.
is the role of the church, and I do know that
Wow.
a lot of Filipino American communities are very religious. I came from, I didn't grow up in the church, but I have a lot of experience and time with Chinese American evangelicalism and just evangelical spaces in general, which tend to be more conservative. I think, yeah, the church is the source of a lot of
Yeah.
ideas that people have about race and what's going on in the world. I've heard in immigrant churches, messages where it's like, we really need to get these illegal immigrants out because we came to this
Wow.
country the right way, and God wants us to do it the right way,
Oh man.
which is, again, an erasure of like all of the systemic barriers that make the right way impossible.
And just even the usage of it just boils my blood. So I grew up in the church. I'm Christian, and I just see a lot of my own faith community using biblical verses or to apply to their concept of what's right in this country, and even people like we need to pray for Donald Trump as he
Yeah.
sets things right. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the usage of like our faith practice.
Yeah, it's so
And
intense. Yeah, I think we really need to think about how our faith has been used as a weapon for white supremacy, honestly.
Ooh,
And it's so hard because our faith is something that is so sacred and intimate to us. And the
yeah,
church, I know, even for myself, has been a space of community and belonging. And that means a lot for, I think,
totally.
immigrants in particular, who maybe when they first come here, they don't have a space to be with people who look like them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, our religious texts and structures have really been co opted by white supremacy for their own political agenda and even for our own colonization.
I always wonder though, the word used. This is me not having like a very, very high understanding of it. But when I hear things like the state has used or propagated or set this up this way, maybe understanding what they mean was.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could see it in the ways that, you know, one of the tools of colonization were missionaries.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
so hard because, and I'm not here to um, drag anyone's, religious affiliation.
Yeah.
Faith is has always been a really big part of my life. And I
Totally.
identify as Christian too. And it's because I love the church that I
Yeah.
feel the
Because
need.
you love it, you want to be
Yeah,
critical about it.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think, like, again, in history, like, we see how missionaries brought sometimes really great things to communities,
Hmm.
and at the same time use spirituality as a tool to make them more American or to like
Yeah. Just to
demonize.
indoctrinate so much
Yeah,
belief of people.
yeah, and to really demonize like their own
Mm,
indigenous practices.
yeah.
I know in the Philippines, like for example, people who we would now identify as queer or trans, that was not the language they would necessarily use, but they were often the religious leaders and healers and military decision makers of their communities. But it was through colonization and missionaries coming when a lot of those folks who were non-binary were actually demonized, criminalized, and killed. And so again, you see how like, yeah, there's just a lot. There's just a lot.
Yeah, but, in the present, I am seeing, and you're probably seeing this too, a lot of more, progress, outspoken churches around current events and
Yeah.
how to wrestle with injustice. Churches like that really taking a stance on how to be a church that are I guess, how to be a body that is around activism, and I always like to say, Jesus Christ was the OG activist and organizer of his time.
Totally.
And then I always wonder, okay, how can churches really utilize their own platform to mobilize and to create more solidarity? But then I remember your guys' talk yesterday saying the civil rights movement, that was faith-based and led, and is that something that we can look back to?
Yeah,
And
I mean, I think we can look to the Black church as having really modeled for us throughout history and to today what it means to practice a theology that liberates us, that activates solidarity and taking to the streets. I think in reality, most churches are preaching the opposite thing. And so this goes back to the intergenerational
Mhm.
talking to our elders
Yeah.
question, because I think like a lot of these ideas they get actually do come from the church. And so I think like if our churches are not preaching anti-racism and standing up for each other, which I believe is the heart of God, then
Mm.
what does it look like for us to actually engage and organize them and align them with, like you said, Jesus the activist?
Yeah. Yes. I've had a few talks with people in my community, family members who are so, very committed to their faith and their practice. And it's like, how do you not see that this is the exact thing that Jesus was
It's
walking and
so hard.
doing,
Yeah.
and it's like, how are you not making that connection that this is what this looks like, So, oh, I'm sure like you're doing voluntary work. Is that playing a role right now and faith into practice?
I think the organization I volunteer for actually organizes for queer affirmation
Yeah. Okay.
in
Yeah.
Asian churches. We are not super active right now because I think all of us as individuals are extremely busy.
Oh,
But I do
totally.
want to highlight one of our members. They're a pastor, they're a Filipino, and they actually do a lot of solidarity work in the Philippines against the violence that Duterte is enforcing. But they
Mm,
really have been activating church groups to take to the streets and, like we were
mhm.
talking about earlier, to practice this liberation theology and
Yeah.
help church folks, specifically Asian Americans in churches, build solidarity, build these connections, and understand that this is what God commands and this is the heart of God. And for us as people of faith, it actually is really important that we show up.
Yeah, yeah, totally. On your Instagram, when I think about solidarity and our people like being united, it really spoke to me that you posted that like the doodle. I don't know what you call it. What do you call it? The booklets? I'm sorry, I don't want to get the word
No,
wrong.
it's okay. I don't really have a name for it either, so it's
Okay.
fine.
Okay, good. I get very cautious about like using the right or wrong words.
No,
Like,
you're
so,
good.
anyways, on that, you posted like a booklet about let me go about Black and Asian solidarity. There was a series, and it was Buffalo Soldiers and the Philippines. And the reason I want to highlight this is because most of our listeners are Filipino, and a lot of us probably don't know about this story that I think is super. It could be super symbolic with how we can think about our brothers and sisters in the Black community and allyship and what they actually allied with us in the past. So can you
Yeah.
talk more about this?
Yeah, this is such a beautiful story that I also wish was uplifted more. But basically, Buffalo Soldiers were mostly Black soldiers, Black Army units, and this is during the Philippine American War. And so basically, they had been sent over to the Philippines to complete America's project for
Yeah.
colonizing the Philippines. But once they got there, they found that also, like, let's not erase the fact that there are also Black Filipinos that exist. Once they got there, they realized, like, their struggle is our struggle. They look more like us than
Mm,
the people who are sending us here care
yeah.
about us.
Yeah.
Um, and they found themselves actually more aligned with the cause of Filipino independence than with the American Empire. And so there was a contingency of Buffalo Soldiers who actually abandoned their posts, which is like, you can lose your life for that. But that's how
That's like,
much it meant to them to be on what they saw as the right side of history. And so they
mm,
actually abandoned their posts and joined the Filipinos in fighting the Americans. Yeah, I think at the same time, like, a lot of Black thought leaders were criticizing America going into the Philippines,
yeah.
saying that we don't even have equality here. There is no, like, idea of democracy that,
Wow.
we can spread there because we can't even get it right here. And
Yeah.
so, a lot of Black thought leaders were calling on Black folks to not support this war. And this
Mm,
happened, with the Vietnam War too, where again, the Black community really showed up to get American troops out of our countries.
mhm.
Mhm.
Oh, my heart breaks when I hear about how that community has continuously been showing up,
Mhm.
not just for themselves, but for other communities, despite all the historical hardship and oppression and violence happening to them. It's like the same theme around like justice. Can you say it one more time?
Oh, yeah, we're not free until everyone is free. I did
Yes.
not say that quote, by the way. We'll have to fact
Yeah.
check and make sure we cite the source. It was probably a
Oh,
Black woman.
oh, for sure. No, I've seen that quote before. It's
I
like,
think it's Fannie Lou Hamer, I think.
yeah. Okay, you know what? I have Google. Oh, it is Lou Hammer. Okay.
Okay.
Anyway, sorry. Yes. Anyways,
Mhm.
I kind of want to take it now to this last part here about how we move forward and show up as allies now that like the first part is really remembering the legacy, like you said, about how we have our rights and
Mhm.
how the Black community has showed up for us. So, like now, how do we show up as allies? And you talk a lot about you've talked about performative solidarity. Maybe you
Mhm.
could give a quick definition of like what that means and why we need to be really aware of that versus like really moving into effective allyship.
Yeah, performative solidarity. I actually learned that term from Jaya Tolentino, who actually is a Filipina, who wrote an awesome book about it called Trick Mirror. But the idea is basically that, like with social media, it is so easy, in my
Yep.
opinion, to post something like the
Like
best way.
Blackout Tuesday.
Yeah, no shade to people who did that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
and so really to name that solidarity can be performative asks us to think critically about what else we are doing in our real lives offline,
Yeah.
to really be pushing these conversations and to really be about this, beyond what we can perform or signal to the public.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of what we can do, I think there's a lot of like action guides out there in terms of signing petitions, showing up with your body on the streets. That is a huge deal if you are able to do so. Donating to Black organizations, supporting Black businesses. But I think, from what I hear, the ask from the Black community is for us to talk to our own community members. And so,
Mhm.
I totally hear
Yeah.
like it is so hard to talk
Yeah.
to our elders and our aunties, but
That's the hardest. That's where we need to be. That's where we're asked to be warriors right now.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and I love that you say that because I think we're educating ourselves, but it's like, what are you going to do with your education? Like, yes, we can be with our own like activist community, but it's only so good as you can take it back to where there really needs to be decolonizing work done, which is
yeah,
within our spaces. And so I do love that you mentioned that. And I don't know, to people listening, we are being asked to do work within our own communities. Like, come
mhm.
on.
Yeah, so I think that I mean, some creative ways that I've seen, I actually, someone reached out to me because she's starting like a discussion group for several weeks where they're inviting guest speakers to talk to um,
Mm,
her group of friends. Basically, they're just a group of friends who want to learn more,
mm.
and that to me is like a creative
That
commitment
is so good.
that
Yeah.
people can make. Or I know people who have started book groups at their churches or with their friends, and then of course people are talking to their parents, and
Mhm.
it really is about, I think it can be really draining, and so
Yeah.
I think it really is about setting a moral boundary that this is what I believe. And if you kind of say like anti-Black, very dehumanizing, racist things, like it's a moral boundary I have to protect, as opposed to like I have to win this argument or I have to convince
Yeah.
this person, because that can be really
Mm.
tiring.
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I think a lot of people do shy away from that because it can get very ugly fast with like
Yeah.
with family when it comes to those conversations where so there's a way to do it with love and I think with awareness about how our own older relatives and families were conditioned and the culture that they grew up with so that there's this balance of like I want to educate you but I also need to do it right if this is going to be successful.
Mhm.
So yeah, thank you for sharing all those. If I always like to ask people this, but Bianca, has there been a successful conversation you've had with a family member?
Oh, um, I think I've actually been talking, I think, to my parents about this for a few years, and so I think
Yeah.
I and they're easier to talk to, I think, because they're very
Okay.
open-minded just as people.
Okay.
Um,
That's a good way.
yeah,
God, that's a good place to start.
and so I think with my dad, for example, he talked about like wanting to show up at the protest, and I was actually really surprised by that. But he got the time wrong. He's also, older, and so I want him to be mindful that we're still in a pandemic. And so one way that I've tried to encourage him is to actually donate to the organizations and the bail funds, and I need to follow up with him on that. I've also tried to talk to my cousins and just kind of be a resource to them. I know that a lot of them,
Yeah.
they might be listening, so hey guys. um, but
Yeah.
yeah, they're processing a lot of things and they're thinking really critically about what it means to show up. And so I'm just trying to, yeah, again, be there as a resource. I do have one younger cousin who I think like um, kind of in his own world right now, but
Mhm.
and doesn't really see kind of the point of all this from what I can tell. But
Yeah.
again, we just have to be patient and be persistent.
Yeah, absolutely. Bianca, I want to hold some space for you to talk about what you feel Asian and Black solidarity means in this context of time. What hope we can see
Hmm.
from this.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's committing to our own unlearning, like we've talked about. there's a lot of resources out there for white people to do this work, but we have a different journey that is unique to us. And one way we can figure that out and navigate it is learning our own histories together. I think about, the activists who have come before us, like Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri Kochiyama, like their solidarity was actually really grounded in deep relationship with the Black community. There's a lot of reading guides out there, and reading is really important, but reading isn't going to solve the problem. Like, we need to be in relationship, in community with people who are different from us, and have a commitment to these people in our lives to really, I think, transform us in a deep way.
That's beautiful. I feel very like, I guess, like filled with hope when you talk about this, because it feels like there is a way. And like, I always feel like, okay, this can all happen right now, but is change really gonna come after this? But I do see our community being awakened right now and like realizing like, holy shit, this is where we are still. And like, this is where I need to start as an individual. And I think that's why that's what I'm seeing now. Like, people are realizing like they need to kind of look within themselves too. And starting from there. And I think that is like the best place to start, because it just starts outpouring from a more like a sustainable place. And we are in this for the long game. And I really thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the work that you are doing, have done, continually do. I know that I'm not even anywhere close to being an educator and like an organizer like you. But I know how it takes a lot of energy on a consistent basis just to be there and kind of like have your heart there. And from the bottom of my heart and from the rest of, the community and from people who listen to this and hear your words, they're probably getting new language and frameworks that they've never seen it before. And so I just want to continuously commend you for what you're doing and thank you for that and for your heart for this. So thank you.
Gosh, you're gonna make me cry, Crystal. Thank you for having me and uplifting. Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for creating this podcast, creating this platform. It was a lot of fun to have this conversation.
We'll keep on the fight.
Sounds good.
Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Feel free to leave a comment about what you thought. And if you haven't yet, follow on Instagram at Filipino on the Rise. I hope to see you and hear from you there. Thanks, everyone.